Welcome to Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. My name is Michelle Dingle. I will be your host today, August 23rd, the United Nations designated International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition. We are honored and delighted to have with us Dr. Marcus Rediker, Professor of Atlantic History at the University of Pittsburgh, and Dr. Corey Walker, Professor of Humanities at Wake Forest University. They have returned to explore with us another chapter in the story of captive and enslaved Africans and their descendants. The subject of this webinar is Dr. Rediker's recently published book, Freedom Ship: The Uncharted History of Escaping Slavery by Sea. It has been described as a definitive, sweeping account of the Underground Railroad's long overlooked maritime origins, a groundbreaking new look at the long untold history of the secret world of stowaways and the vessels that carried them to freedom. Leading the discussion is Dr. Walker. Now, we have a lot to cover during this session, and I want to leave about 15 minutes for your questions and their answers. I want to encourage everyone to please use the chat for general discussion throughout. However, please use the Q&A feature for any questions so that we can address them immediately after this discussion. So that means please don't wait to put in your questions. I would like to have the queue ready to go when we get to Q&A. So put your questions in as they come to mind. Now, I will turn this over to our guests. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Marcus. It's so good to be with you again, my dear friend, and to discuss this amazing book, Freedom Ship. Marcus, I want to begin our conversation with a quote from C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James in 1952 was on Ellis Island. He was incarcerated, about to be deported from the U.S., and he wrote his classic tale of American democracy in the mid-20th century by revisiting the 19th century. And he revisited Melville's Moby Dick with mariners, renegades, and castaways. Moby Dick and Melville, Herman Melville, and the world in which we live. And in that text, he opens up with a question. And that question is, why in Melville's Moby Dick did the crew members aboard the Pequod rebel against their diabolical captain? Why didn't they rebel against their diabolical captain? In many ways, Freedom Ship reminds us that there were folks who rebelled and also looked to the sea for that freedom. So tell us a bit about this book, Marcus, and how we got here from your book, The Slave Ship.
Okay, thank you. And Corey, just to say, a pleasure to be with you, my friend. I always enjoy these events, these conversations. And I think some of these questions this evening, I want to turn back to you. So I want to know what you think about various important issues. So yes, it's true that Freedom Ship, in its title and in its content, is in many ways a direct sequel to a book I published in 2007 called The Slave Ship: A Human History. And that work, of course, was an extremely difficult book to write. It meant chronicling the system of extraordinary violence that made the Atlantic slave trade possible, the experience of the millions of Africans who made this brutal voyage into the killing maw of the American plantation system. But in so doing, they also pioneered certain techniques of resistance. So one of the things I say in Freedom Ship is that to me, it's remarkable that the descendants of those people who made that transatlantic voyage on the slave ship turned that same kind of tall ship into a place of freedom, into a place of liberation, by escaping in the thousands. And we just really haven't known much about this. They escaped in the thousands, even the tens of thousands, to freedom in the North, in Canada, in England, and that this is a very important part of the study of resistance to slavery.
So in many ways, we see the sea having this dialectical being a dialectical symbol. The sea as this terror-filled passage, the middle passage. But you look to the water and the sea as this opportunity for freedom, of possibility. And in many ways, this is part of a history of looking to the sea, moving us toward the water. Marcus, can you talk to us a bit about why these histories of people moving on these ships as on the water become so vitally important for us to understand the dialectic between slavery and freedom and the evolution of the modern world?
That's a big question, Corey, and but I'm happy to give it a shot. Um, the first thing to be said is that without tall ships and sailors, and of course all the other workers of the Atlantic world, there's no global system of capitalism. They're the ones, their labor connects the continents. So this is a really critical part of world history. And I think it's really important to know that the duality that you mentioned, the violence, the oppression, and the freedom, those things are kind of built in to life at sea for several reasons. One is that the ruling classes of Europe, who control the slave trade, will always see what they can get away with on the high seas, like a laboratory of class discipline, whether that's disciplining sailors or disciplining the enslaved people who are on their way to the plantation system. But on the other hand, the open sea is a very hard place to control. In other words, it's so vast. This gives it a kind of quality that allows people to use it for their own purposes. I wrote about how pirates built a kind of democratic and egalitarian society. They were like floating maroons in a way, escaping from the plantation system. And the same thing happens in the 19th century when these thousands of people board northern ships in southern ports and make those freedom ships. Now, the northern merchants who are sending those ships to the south to pick up tobacco, rice, and cotton don't want those people to get on board, but those people develop relationships with sailors, dock workers, market women, and they use that commerce for their own freedom struggle.
Tell us a bit about this culture that you're describing. I mean, it seems to be this, I mean, when you think of this maritime culture, you have all of these African Americans enslaved and some free working in these dock areas, and they're moving about, they're exchanging information, there are opportunities for freedom passages. But it seems to be a vibrant world that oftentimes when we think of the history of slavery, particularly in the United States, we're landlocked, we're land focused, but we miss what's going on in the dynamism of the sea.
Well, it's been a big theme of my work, Corey, as you know, to say that the ships on the Atlantic and the docks, the several blocks from the edge of the ocean into the port city, those are that's where the motley crew works. This multiracial, multi-ethnic group of workers who are really a key to the operation of the economy, loading and unloading those ships, distributing the cargo. The labor of these people means everything. And so one of the things that I wanted to do in writing Freedom Ship was essentially to make it a labor history in which workers enslaved and free, black and white and every other color and ethnicity, these are people who are working together. Now they're working together to make profits for merchants and enslavers. But once they start to work together, they can develop projects of their own. And one of those big projects is getting people on board these ships, stowing them away, and helping them to make their way to freedom. So I guess my point here is that we lose something very important when we don't attend to all these maritime linkages, which are the greatest sources of economic dynamism in this period.
The way in which these waterways connect these land masses and connect cultures. When you think of that Atlantic world, you think of the exchanges of commerce, culture, and people and ideas between African cultures, European cultures, and the Americas. And in many ways, you open that up. This idea of freedom doesn't just mean freedom on land, it is also freedom to move. And that movement then gives ideas of democracy, ideas of social organization beyond just a land-centric focus. Talk to us a bit about those communities and the ways they're reimagining how to organize political life and social life in this moment, and how the ship becomes emblematic of these new ways of thinking and of organizing human life in this emerging moment of modernity.
Yes, the ship really is a way of organizing human society, and it is a key. It is a as you say, it's highly symbolic of another social order, or at least another potential social order. So I think one of the things that people on the waterfront see is the limits of power of landed authorities. They see that their authority does not extend all the way out into the oceans. So that then becomes a liberated zone. Okay, so the ship is not just an avenue to freedom, it's a key to mobility, which is a constituent part of freedom. I mean, look, this is a period in which national boundaries are being established everywhere, and these national boundaries, to a large extent, are meant to keep poor people in place wherever they may be. And so consequently, the struggle for mobility is really critical. And then there's this other thing, Corey, which is really important. If you try to escape slavery by land, you're going to have to go, in many cases, hundreds of miles over unknown territory where every single white person is deputized to arrest you if they have any suspicion that you might be a fugitive. But if you get on a ship, and if the sailors on that ship are sympathetic, then you're going to make it straight to the north without that kind of danger, right? So the ship offers an avenue to freedom, which I think is extremely unusual, not nearly as dangerous. Now, that's not to say that these escapes by sea don't go wrong sometimes. They do. And of course, you know, and everybody should know what the stakes are in these escapes, right? If you run away and it fails, you're going to pay with the flesh on your back, and you might even pay with your life. But that's the way the sea beckons you with possibilities of a new life in a place where slavery's been abolished.
Well, Marcus, let's talk a bit about some of the stories that many of the expressions of that freedom that you have in the book. You have a wonderful chapter on Frederick Douglass. You engage Harriet Jacobs, but you also, as a great grand historian of histories from below, we not only know those well-known names, you also remind us that there were many other actors in this space. Talk to us a bit about some of the well-known and some of those who you're now making known to us, who are using the sea as these routes of possibility and of freedom.
It's absolutely true, Corey. Frederick Douglass was a man of the waterfront. He says himself in his autobiographies, everything that became possible in his life was because he lived on the waterfront. He learned about freedom on the waterfront. He dressed as a sailor when he escaped. Harriet Jacobs and her extraordinary ordeal of escaping slavery in Edenton, North Carolina, she had three uncles who were all sailors. So the maritime skill and knowledge of that family was crucial to her escape. And of course, she will go on to write one of the most important exposés of sexual terror as waged by white enslavers, in her case, a man named Dr. Norcom, a really critical book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861. So freedom by sea made possible some of the great literature of the abolition movement, the kind that both Douglas and Jacobs wrote. But I would like to talk about the lesser known people because they are very important. And I'll just mention a man named Moses Roper. I must tell you, I read the story of Moses Roper's life. He did publish it when he got to England around 1835. And I read it in awe, to be perfectly honest, because this was a man who, from the age of 13, was absolutely 100% committed to escaping slavery, no matter what it took. So between the ages of 13 and 19, he ran away a dozen times. And every time he'd get caught, he'd get beaten, he'd get tortured, and then he'd do it again. And nobody could tame him. He actually said about one of his enslavers, a man named John Gooch, he said at some point, his whole storehouse of tortures seemed to be exhausted. He couldn't break him. So eventually he travels hundreds of miles over land from Apalachicola, Florida to Savannah, and then from there sails to New York, goes up the Hudson River to Vermont, New Hampshire, Boston, back down to New York, and then to Liverpool. This is one of the longest journeys on this maritime system of escape. 4,400 miles. And when he arrives in England, he becomes a spokesperson in the abolitionist movement and goes around lecturing people about his life and how he escaped.
Marcus, that's amazing. And I want to shift our focus a bit because we have freedom ship now. We talked about your 2007 book, Slave Ship. That's how we opened up the conversation. Why has it taken us so long? I mean, we know we have some works in the in the mid 1980s around African American sailors, and there are even wonderful articles in the the Journal of Negro History, started by Carter G. Woodson in the before 1950, on the centrality of the sea to the history of slavery and freedom. But now we're getting more and more work on it. And the freedom ship is now really a crystallization of some of that. Can you talk to us a bit about the trend of the history that really enables us to move beyond the vision of the land as the only space for holding history, and now the sea as the space of holding history?
Well, Corey, as you know, for my entire career, I've been trying to get people to see that history happens on the oceans. There's this very strange kind of bias that we have, a sort of uninspected bias in our minds that history happens only on land and only in nation states. Well, uh, the slave trade is a perfect example of how history happens at sea, right? You've got race formation, class formation, culture formation, and you've got profound resistance in the struggle against slavery. So history happens at sea. And for many years, Corey, I would ask myself, why can't people see this? And I actually invented a word to describe the kind of bias that blinds us to history happening at sea. And I called it terracentrism, which means basically land-based history. But once you get beyond that and see that the oceans of the world are not historical voids, that very real and important things are happening there, then you understand the history in an entirely new way. So I think this has been one of the biggest holdups. See, the other thing is sailors, for example, they play a very small role in national histories, right? Which have these boundaries which are artificial, right? They block out as much as they reveal. But once you get into transatlantic history, transnational history, world history, you've got to have sailors. You've got to have seafaring people. You've got to have people making these profound voyages and many, many middle passages. So that to me really is crucial in understanding the world as it exists today.
Marcus, you also highlight the way in which information and ideas flow. And of course, building on the work of that pioneering dissertation of mid-1980s, Julius Scott's The Common Wind, that late Julius Scott's Common Wind, that now it's come out as a book. These ships really remind us that the ideas of freedom are moving around this maritime escape route. These maritime worlds are also embedded with all of these ideas about how we can move around, how we can envision new ways of thinking about freedom, new ways of thinking about culture, new ways of thinking about community. Talk to us a bit about how these ideas of moving and shaping freedom in this Atlantic world that is moving, this Atlantic world that's in motion. I love when you focus in on that this is a world that is in motion. It is not static. It is not moving to a singular linear temporality. It is moving, it is dynamic, and there are cultures that are coming together.
I'm so pleased, Corey, that you mentioned Julius Scott. His book, The Common Wind, I would recommend to everybody. I think it's one of the most profound books written in the past 50 years. As you say, the book remained unpublished for, I think it was 32 years, but finally came out in 2018. And what Julius Scott showed is something that I've worked on too, is that these mobile workers, these sailors, these dock workers, market women, people who are moving, they are vectors of knowledge, right? They're not just workers. They are people who have experience, and frequently what they have is experience of resistance, experience of struggle. And so what Julius wrote about was the circulation by sea of the experience and knowledge of the Great Haitian Revolution, which then had a tremendous impact in lots of other places. You see very similar things going on in Freedom Ship. This is a book about these vectors of resistance, and it's the constant pressure of that resistance that really matters.
I'm reminded of some of the work when of important colleague of mine and important influence, the late Reginald Butler. His book this month just got published. His too, another dissertation, much like Jesse Lemish's dissertation that you added the foreword to from the 1960s. Here are these pioneering works. Reginald's work reminds me, was instrumental for me to pay attention to the water for African American Freemasons because he introduced us to the Bateau men moving up and down the James. They were moving goods, services, people, and ideas up and down the James River. So folks coming in from the Atlantic world up the James River in Virginia and then through Central Virginia. So we had this sort of, we created this project around diaspora, Jefferson, Monticello's diaspora, so that Jefferson's Monticello would not just stay static in Central Virginia, in Albemarle County, but it is part and parcel of this Atlantic world. You do much of the same for many of the places discussed in your book, from Charleston, South Carolina, and of course, Marcus, you know I'm going to mention it, to my home city, Norfolk, Virginia. Talk to us about the new geographies that emerge in this world in flux and how the water connects all of these cities and places. Marcus, I think you hit your mute button.
Let me begin with something that was both in your previous question and in this one. These mobile workers are thinkers. You know, there is an intellectual history of the struggle. And sailors are kind of known to be philosophers of sorts. So, and as I say at the very beginning of Freedom Ship, escaping slavery was as much an intellectual act as a physical act. So I think that, you know, part of the humanity of these people in resistance is recognizing that they have ideas, that they carry news, they carry strategic information about struggles that were going on somewhere else. Okay, so that is really, really important, and I think that's a big part of this book. But it's true, if you look at things from the seaside, you do see a different geography. What you see are a series of linked port cities. And I actually have some colleagues in Liverpool who wrote a book arguing that the residents of different port cities around the Atlantic have more in common with each other than they do with the people in the hinterlands in the same nation, because port cities breed a kind of common way of life and some common practices of resistance. So I do think that once we fully integrate the maritime into our historical vision, we'll see there'll be new ways of seeing the world. And here's the other thing, Corey. The model for understanding most societies based in anthropology is people are sedentary and stable and held in place. But if you look at the actual history of people in motion, as you mentioned a moment ago, you need different concepts to understand their lives. They are in motion. They don't have quite the same resources, but they have to invent new ones. They have to invent new ways to fight. Sailors invent the strike in 1768, taking down the sails of vessels in London. That's called striking the sails. So this multi-ethnic maritime proletariat has got to invent new ways of struggle. And so I think that's something else that we're beginning to understand as well.
In this moment of freedomship, in many ways, we're defining freedom as a particular ideal that is gifted to us in and through the emergence of modern democracy and modern forms of democracy and modern forms of the nation state. But as you're suggesting and as your work demonstrates, what we see with freedom ships and the actions of these actors who are beginning to develop these alternative geographies, you have another wonderful term, and along with terracentrism, you have another term, hierarchy. And how can we begin to think of this moment in relation, this democratic moment that is overpowered in many ways, some of the historiography, with the hierarchy that you're reminding us of, and that is very much part of the Atlantic world. I mean, it's not an isolated instance. If you're thinking of people moving, goods moving, just as you stated, it is culture being developed on sea. It is the emergence of capitalism. It's not just the commodities, but the commodities have to move to new markets. And you also have the movement of labor. And if you're moving large swaths of labor, the sea is the conduit to do that.
Mhm. Yeah, no, this is an absolutely critical point, Corey. I think you put it better than I could have, to be perfectly honest. But I think again, if we pay close attention to the way people wage the battle for freedom, right? Now, freedom is going to mean a lot of different things to different people. The fugitives that I studied, some of them wanting to escape violence. Some of them wanted to escape and reunite with their families, especially since their family members had been sold off by the enslavers. Some people simply wanted a fair wage for their labor. There are just many different definitions of freedom. But the question is really, who decides and how do you get into a position to be able to make those decisions? So this is the thing. There is this powerful maritime radical tradition. The Many-Headed Hydra, a book that I wrote. I See You, Dell. This is a book about a transatlantic radical tradition that involved Africans and Europeans and Native Americans. There were many different constituent forces and powers within it. David Walker, who wrote the famous Appeal in 1829, 1830, is himself a product of this Atlantic maritime radical tradition. And of course, in writing that book, urging enslaved people in America to rise up and follow the example of the people of Haiti in waging revolution, that is a major contribution to this maritime radical tradition. And so all of these people who are in motion, all of these white sailors who help the black fugitives, they're all part of something that's much bigger. And they do have their own ideas of freedom, their own ideas of democracy, and they have more advanced ideas of equality than the vast majority of people who are running governments anywhere around the world.
Marcus, as we move toward our question and answer session, I want us to really talk now, shift our conversation to really about the memory of this particular episode or these episodes and why they become so important and why they're so important now. Here on this remembrance of this UNESCO International Day for the Remembrance of Slavery and its Abolition, we're reminded that at this time in 1791 in Saint-Domingue in Haiti, we have the beginnings of the Haitian Revolution. So it's calling us to a particular ethic of memory. How would you suggest that freedomship calls us to a particular ethic of memory that can then inform how we understand our lives today?
Well, Corey, let me begin by saying this, and I would like to know how you think about this yourself. I would argue that the study of race and slavery over the past, let's say, 60 years is the best body of scholarship produced anywhere in the world. And the dilemma with that is that what scholars have uncovered, what we have learned about slavery, but also resistance to slavery, is so extraordinary, but there hasn't always been this linkage to high schools, to other educational institutions. And we've got to work on that, especially now, right? Especially now when this best body of scholarship is now recognized as something dangerous and something to be suppressed in libraries, in schools, and all the rest. So my view of freedomship is that it is just one among many hundreds of books that have tried to recover the freedom story in all of its dimensions. Because in my view, if we are to have a better future, all of this historical memory has got to be central to it. There's really no way of moving forward without knowing the specificity of the oppression in the past, but also the extraordinarily heroic resistance to it. Those things go together. They went together from the beginning on the slave ships, all the way up through and beyond the Civil War. So we need these stories to guide us. We need these stories to inspire us. And most of all, we need these stories so that we'll know that we are not alone, that many of the issues of freedom, democracy, equality that we care about now, people have been fighting for these things for hundreds of years. That's really important for us to know. That's empowering to know.
Well, Marcus, I would agree with you on that. I think when we think of this history, and for those who are in it all the time, as one who's just grown up and been shaped by it, both intellectually and in the ways in which not only I engage the academy, but also the broad public.
Mhm.
These ideas are about the modern world. We can't understand the modern world, the creation of how we understand of what it means to be human in the world,
Mhm.
or can we understand the ways in which we have ideas and institutions and individuals that move and shape our world without understanding these deep connections? When you do your work and connect the sea and sailors, and when we understand the symbols around them, the symbols of freedom, the reality of freedom, and also slavery. We can't do that outside of understanding these spaces as connected spaces, as
Mhm.
interconnected spaces. The new histories that are emerging around the Indian Ocean world
Mhm.
and the Pacific world. These places are connected in deep and consequential ways. And much like what C.L.R. James did with Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, we can't understand the modern world without understanding all of the ways in which these ideas are connected that then help to shape and form who we are as citizens, as people, and our conceptions of what it means to be human in the world. When I when I read Freedom Ship, and when I read your scholarship, Marcus, what I'm always amazed at is not only the deep historical knowledge. One thing that we have to recognize is that the archives that you're drawing from to begin to narrate these stories are often overlooked, but they're also looked at from a different categorical frame.
Mhm.
And it's those categorical framings, what C.L.R. James would remind us, the categories have us by the throat. If
Mhm.
we're looking for certain things only in certain ways, we can't see connections. So I would never be able to see, for instance, the deep connections between Charleston, South Carolina, and the city I live in now, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. It is the Moravian trade that has to go to Charleston because the port at Wilmington doesn't offer enough trade access and the port is not as deep. So you have an overland route to get to Charleston that has deeper portage. And of course, Edenton. Edenton becomes central to even my university here at Wake Forest, where we would then sell enslaved Africans in order to save the university on May 7th, 1860. This is one thing
Mhm.
that happens in the world, but we would not be able to think of that if we just think of it as these site-based, place-based, and in an absolute isolated sense, history. So the sea just opens up opportunities for us to move and then develop a broader ethic so that we can connect ourselves with a broader world. And Marcus, this broader world becomes important because your attention to the sea also reminds us that in this moment of climate change, we have rising seas. And in many ways, that connects us planetarily. Can you
Mhm.
talk to us a bit about your work, your contemporary work? I know you have a project that looks at migration across seas in our contemporary moment. That's a result of the ways in which our polities are no longer working democratically and that are responding to the climate crisis that we have and that we're facing planetarily.
Corey, let me just say to everything you said, amen. I think what you said is really important, and I'm glad you said it. Yeah, the oceans continue to be a critical issue in our time. The extreme degradation of the oceans, the pollution of the oceans, the rapid overheating of the oceans, they are such a source of life for us. And I do think that climate change, if it's not reversed, will lead to catastrophic change that is linked to ocean currents, for example, in the Atlantic. The warming and cooling system of the Atlantic may be defunct in a fairly small number of years. So overcoming this terracentrism is not just important for understanding the past, it's for understanding the present and the future.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. Dr. Rediker, Dr. Walker, this has been an incredible conversation. All right, we have a lot of questions that have come through the Q&A. So are you all ready to jump right in?
Let's go.
Let's go.
Okay.
I'm ready.
All right, Dr. Rediker, this comes from Kathy Lawrence. Have there been any significant discoveries since your book was written?
The one that was just published in May?
Mhm.
Well, okay, let me say this. There has been very important research done on escaping slavery by sea by other scholars. I do want to recognize them. I first started studying this issue of people escaping by sea back in the 1980s when I was working on the many-headed Hydra. I came back to the subject about 5 years ago, but very important work has been done by David Siselsky on maritime North Carolina, by Cassandra Newby Alexander on Norfolk and the entire Chesapeake area, and Timothy D. Walker has gotten together an excellent group of scholars to produce a book called Sailing to Freedom. So, in my view, my book is part of that work. And that what we really need to do is to get a lot more people working on this kind of subject. I reckon that there are dozens of books that could still be written on maritime routes of escape in the Mississippi River, in the Gulf of Mexico, and the Great Lakes. You know, this is a big, big topic.
Okay. All right. We're gonna just rapid fire these out, okay?
Yeah.
They're piling up. Is there any, oh, this comes from Michael Levitt. Is there any estimation of enslaved people using the ports above Boston, like Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and ports in Maine? On a judge in Portsmouth comes to mind. Thank you.
Absolutely. Ports in Maine are the sites. In anywhere vessels leave northern ports, go to the south and return, that is a potential line of escape. There's a big battle in Maine, actually in 1837, between the governor of Maine and the governor of Georgia. So I have concentrated on the main port cities, basically Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington, North Carolina, Norfolk, Baltimore in the south, and then Philadelphia, New York, New Bedford, and Boston in the north. But all of the ports received maritime escapees. I would really like to emphasize that.
All right. Another question from Peter Fay. Most of your book seems to focus on Southern slavery post-independence, but for over 150 years, there was Northern slavery and the Rhode Island slave trade. Many Northern slaves fled by sea, including many during the Revolutionary War by sea to New York and Nova Scotia. Is there another bias in American history, in addition to the ones you mentioned, that ignores the seaborne flight from Northern slavery?
That's a subject for a very important book. I do believe that is something that I would encourage the person asking this question to study it. I only studied really the last 30 years prior to the Civil War, around 1829, when David Walker wrote his appeal, up to the outbreak of Civil War in 1861. But escaping by sea goes back really to the very beginning of enslavement in the North and in the South. So this is part of a very big and broad pattern.
Okay. What percentage of slave ships, if any, travel to Puerto Rico ports? And were there any slave revolts or a secret society for freedom at sea?
I don't have the specific numbers for Puerto Rico at hand, but if you go online to a website called slavevoyages.org, this is an extraordinary database. You can actually see exactly how many ships and roughly, but fairly accurately, the number of enslaved people who were taken to Puerto Rican ports. So that is knowable. In terms of what happened on the slave ships on the way there and elsewhere, there are many, many hidden forms of resistance on the lower deck in which people are forming new kinds of cultures that are, if you look at it from one direction, Pan-African, but if you look at it from the other Western sort of vantage point, they are African American in the broadest sense, and that American as in the Americas, right, in which new cultural combinations are happening based on the backgrounds of the people who were on board the ship. So now this is, I studied this as best I could on British and American slave ships in the 18th century. There's a lot of work on the slave trade to Brazil, which was huge, and even more on the slave trade to the Caribbean. But we are understanding that the means of resistance were much greater than we thought. For a long time, it was believed that there were very few revolts on slave ships, but now we know that there were a great many, and our knowledge of that is only growing.
Okay. Please tell us more about the sources upon which your research was based. Beyond the well-known stories of Douglas, Jacobs, and Roper, did captains' logs, for example, provide historical evidence, newspaper articles, sailors' diaries?
There are, well, first thing you have to know is that if you're going to do history from below, you have to be very creative in the search for sources, new sources. It definitely helped me that I'd been working in maritime archives for more than 30 years when I came to this, because maritime archives are a little different. But there are several main bodies of sources, one of which is the very important set of narratives that enslaved people wrote after they escaped to freedom. Now, many of these were written with or even by white abolitionists, so they have to be used with great care. But in most cases, you can hear the voice of the fugitive, him or herself. That's a very important source because you do hear what people actually think about their own experience. I compiled a database of around 1,500 advertisements in which enslavers thought that people had escaped by sea. Now, they didn't really know, and sometimes they were being systematically double crossed. You know, you make someone think you're going one way and you go another. But every newspaper from any port city in the South has got advertisements for people who got away by sea. They'll say things like, last seen in the company of sailors. Um, and one very important thing that is repeated, masters of vessels are warned not to take this person on board. So that's another kind of source. And then a third is that some of the abolitionists kept very detailed records of the people who passed through their offices after they reached the North, including by sea. William Still took down the life stories of about 900 people. Um, so this abolitionist records are another major source.
Marcus, let me ask you, we've used this term a bit in our conversation and you've referenced it, history from below. Can you talk, and I know the audience from some of their questions seems to be interested in how do you do history from below? So can you talk to us a bit about what is
Sure.
history from below?
Yeah. History from below is a kind of social history in which you study ordinary working people, you study their experience, but you also study them to see how they shape the historical process. Okay, so for example, we see that the maritime escapees, about whom we knew very little until quite recently, that they were actually a contributing cause to the coming of civil war. They shaped the history of the 19th century by their very brave and repeated escapes. So history from below is about it's about oppression. It's fundamentally about resistance. It's about the experience and the consciousness of the people down below to the extent that you can recover it. Whenever you can, you try to recover their voices. And maybe most centrally of all, you try to describe their agency. And I really was very impressed to see that Frederick Douglass and William Still talked about this phrase they called invisible agency. And that's kind of what escaping slavery was by sea. It was this constant pressure of resistance, even though most modern historians haven't known much about it. I assure you, Southern elites knew a lot about it and tried really hard to stop it. But History from Below puts working people at the center of the story and tries to understand their lives in a sympathetic way and to understand what their contributions to history actually were. That's the way I would sum it up. Corey, would you add anything to that?
I would just continue to emphasize that this history from below, these historical actors are knowledgeable, organic intellectuals who are working with an entire set of ideas. And one thing that we always have to do is to look and see how those ideas are being expressed. It could be in the ways in which you resist work, the ways in which you play, the ways in which you grab leisure, but then understanding that within an entire worldview that these are individuals much like other humans who are creating the world and the world in which they live and creating the world in which they desire to live.
Well said.
All right, we've got about 5 more minutes, and we're gonna see if we can get in a few more of these questions. Since Black sailors made up some 20% of all American merchant sailors in the 19th century, can you speak to ways they may have changed or influenced shipboard culture to make it more amenable to captains carrying enslaved persons to freedom?
I'm a little surprised by the last part of that question. I will say that Black sailors had a disproportionate influence on the development of maritime culture. And one of the clearest examples of that is that what we know about sea shanties is that they're basically an adapted African form of music and singing in call and response. So this is something that is kind of worldwide, and the African elements of all that are really significant. In terms of what was facilitated in the slave trade, um, there were Black sailors on slave ships. I, to some extent, that's because they did not have very many job options. I think most people would have preferred not to go on one of those vessels, but the wages were somewhat higher. The risks of death were also higher. But I don't think of anything in particular that Black sailors did that facilitated the slave trade more than any other kind of seafaring worker. I think that this was a product of, well, again, it's a motley crew. It's a motley crew. The people who sailed the ships in the slave trade and the other branches of trade were from all over the world. And that's an important part of who they were.
Thank you. How much research has been done on the use of inland rivers and tributaries by freedom seekers to reach the port cities?
There has been some good work done on the Mississippi. That's probably the thing that's been studied most extensively, but I do believe that there is a lot more work to be done on that. New Orleans is kind of a node here, but up and down the Mississippi, there's a movement of people. And as Corey says, the movement of ideas, very significant, going on everywhere. The Great Lakes is yet another place. The Caribbean, I mean, the Caribbean is a central place for the development of world history, not only because of its role in the evolution of the slave system, the plantation system, but also because it's the place of the first great revolution, the Haitian Revolution. So I think there's more work to be done on maritime movement there. Now, N.A.T. Hall did a great essay on maritime marinage, but we can do more.
Okay.
I'd just like to add that
Okay.
recently it's just got published. It was just published this month. Reginald Butler's long awaited book on free blacks in rural Virginia, free blacks in Goochland County, which really uncovers the history of the Bateau men moving up and down the James River as one of the real pioneering ways of uncovering that history and making sure that you have a pathway to it. So if you look at the footnotes in Professor Rediker's Freedom Ship and Reginald Butler's recently published book on Goochland, The Evolution of a Rural Free Black Community, you'll look at the footnotes and then see a method of how to do this type of history and those spaces that you have to look, county courthouses, those county court records, and also looking into material culture to begin to read that quite differently and newly.
Yeah, I would just add, for people who want to do history from below, one of the most important things you need to learn is how a given society at a given moment in time produces documentation about poor people. And the courts are a very important part of that because poor people frequently end up on the wrong side of the law one way or another. So you can get a lot of information out of the courts.
Right, last question. Would you comment on Melville's take on the relationship between the sea and freedom in Benito Sereno?
Well, I will have to limit myself because for years I've wanted to write a book on Melville
Mm.
and the sea. And I think what we see with Melville and freedom is something that runs not just through Benito Sereno, but also he wrote 5 seafaring novels before he wrote Moby Dick. So his experience at sea, Melville, between 1839 and 1844 was absolutely central to his conception as a writer and as a thinker. So what I would want to do is to talk about Melville's relationship to the motley crew, to his shipmates, to people from all over, people like Queequeg, people like Daggoo in Moby Dick. What did he learn from them, right? These people are, as Corey says, they are organic intellectuals of a certain class experience, and they are therefore teachers. So I think what Melville saw and what he saw a vision of freedom at sea that was multi-ethnic, multiracial, genuinely international, and something that was very different from what it was possible to see on land. Most people close their minds and their eyes to the kinds of things that Melville saw on these ships at sea. But I think he still has a lot to teach us about that very different world. He probably was the greatest maritime ethnographer ever.
All
And
right, thank you. Oh, did you
I'll
want
just
to say
add
really
very
quick?
quickly, Marcus, we opened up with CLR James. It'll be a great bookend with James. James reminds us in Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, his engagement with Melville is also the limitations of Melville's form, the form of the novel and Melville's vision, so that he could not fully encapsulate what an alternative would be.
Right.
And so he would write in Mariners, these are groups of people with no allegiances to anyone or anything except the work. They have to do the work and their relations with one another and the relations with one another upon which that work depends. It's an alternative world that CLR James is pushing us toward to begin
Mhm.
to understand it. And Marcus, that you do in an exemplary manner with reminding us that these ships are not only ships for maritime, for merchants, and for nations, but they're also for freedom.
All
That
right,
comes back.
gentlemen.
Let me just one final thing, Corey. That comes back to your opening question about why the crew didn't revolt. There's the limit of Melville's thinking, right?
Mm.
That he could not see that the common work, the dangerous work that they did together, bred the solidarity that they felt that came out of all that. So in that solidarity lay a new possibility.
All right, well, thank you. For the sake of time, unfortunately, we have to end our Q&A right here. The Middle Passage Ceremonies and Park Markers Project, again, thanks you both, Dr. Marcus Rediker and Dr. Corey Walker. The project values your scholarship and willingness to share little-known maritime history related to Black freedom seekers. For those of you who want to delve more deeply, we highly recommend that you get yourself a copy of Dr. Rediker's book, Freedom Ship: The Uncharted History of Escaping Slavery by Sea. This conversation today was insightful and thought-provoking. If there are any questions And there are, because there are still many in the queue that we didn't get to. And if you would like us to follow up on those, please feel free to contact the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project at middlepassagemarkers@gmail.com, and we will forward them to our guests. Thank you all for joining us today. I also want to thank Ann Chin, Ann Cobb, Nick Huster, and the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project Board. I truly hope you enjoyed this session. Now, in order to continue and sustain this kind of work, we do need your financial support. So here's how you can help us out. You can donate through Give Butter. You can mail your donation to Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project, P.O. Box 3071. That's in Jacksonville, Florida, 32206. We also have a Venmo account where you can donate directly to our organization. That information is on the screen. Now, all of these ways, all of the ways to donate are on the website, middlepassageproject.org/support. All right, this ends our program. I hope everyone enjoyed it today. Take care.